Nintendo has come under fire recently for releasing unfinished, content-lacking games which are later finished via updates. The two biggest offenders people will point out are Mario Strikers Battle League and Nintendo Switch Sports. Both games have been some of the lowest rated Nintendo-developed games in the past year and provide people with doubts about the future of the company. In this video, I'll go over some of the Nintendo-developed/published games that use this free update method, what it could mean for the future, and why this tactic has become so prevalent in the Nintendo games. First, let's start by seeing if content can determine a quality title, as I do believe games can be quality without much content. To show an example, let's look at Untitled Goose Game. Untitled Goose Game is an indie game released in 2019, and it would be very fair to call it a quality title. This game's main campaign is rather short though, only lasting a few hours and having a similar structure throughout the areas. Now granted, there is post-game content, but most of it is just the same things as the base game, but slightly different. There are two more games that don't have much content, but are still very quality titles that come to mind: Undertale and Portal. You can argue that Undertale has some of the most content out of any game due to all the unique neutral route endings, but I don't really consider that as substantial content since they remain mostly unchanged aside from a few different pieces of dialogue. In Undertale, you have four main endings: True Pacifist, Pacifist, Neutral, and Genocide, all being able to be beaten in a couple hours assuming you're good at the game. Outside of the main story, there's not much to Undertale. And in Portal, one of the highest rated games of all time, the main campaign can, once again, be beaten in a couple hours, even if you don't know what you're doing. I feel these three examples prove my point that a game doesn't need to have dozens and dozens of hours of content to be considered a quality title. You could make an argument that since these are indie games, though I think Portal is a first-party title, they don't need to be very content-heavy compared to the first-party companies with the budget to get the content to these games. And while that may be true, they still show games without a large amount of content can still be very high-quality titles. Now let's look at some of the biggest Nintendo-published offenders of this ship now, finish later mentality, mainly Mario Strikers Battle League and Nintendo Switch Sports. I've seen a lot of people consider Animal Crossing New Horizons to be one of these games, but I don't see where they're coming from. I personally was able to get in around 350 hours of Animal Crossing before I got bored, and many people I know were able to get thousands of hours before they got bored in Animal Crossing. So even if it was lacking a few features from the past games, I would consider it a great game from launch. With that out of the way, let's look at the latest game that follows this trend, Mario Strikers Battle League. Mario Strikers Battle League, the first Strikers game in 15 years, launched on June 10th, 2022. Being the first game in the beloved series in 15 years, the hype was pretty high. People got upset when Daisy wasn't shown, saying they wouldn't buy the game for that reason, and that reason only. I thought that was kind of stupid, but whatever, I wasn't planning on getting the game anyway since I didn't enjoy Mario Golf and Tennis very much. The game came out at a full $80 price with only 10 characters and 5 stadiums and no hint of a single player campaign. The only really good things you could say about the game is that the gameplay was pretty fleshed out, the game looked good, and the animations are incredible. To go down the rabbit trail for a second, the character animations in Battle League are some of the best I have seen in any game ever. I just love them so much and there's so much character and they're just overall incredible. Good things aside, this lack of content was promised to be somewhat fixed with free content updates over the coming months, and people weren't happy, for a good reason. Paying a full $80 price tag for a bare-bones game that will eventually get updates, it's basically paying full price for an early access game on Steam where it'll be finished eventually. The only difference between early access games and a title like Mario Strikers, however, is that more often than not, early access games are usually cheaper than the full release. This was full price for a lackluster game that'll just be finished later. The second game I want to look at is Switch Sports, and I have a bit more to say on this one since I actually own the game and I'm willing to be a bit more lenient with it, as instead of a full price title, it's $40. I won't go out and say, oh no, game bad because of no me's. That's not why the game is bad. The game isn't even inherently bad, which is something I forgot to mention in Mario Strikers segment. What is there is pretty fun, pretty fleshed out, and overall enjoyable. There's just not a lot of it. That's also why I thought it was important to mention some quality games that don't have much content, to show that even less content-heavy games can still be worth every penny. The difference between a game with little content like Untitled Goose Game and a game with little content like Mario Strikers is that Untitled Goose Game shipped finished. The team did what they wanted, even if it's on the shorter side. In Mario Strikers, it felt like Next Level Games wanted to do a lot more, but was restricted, most likely by time, so they needed to complete their vision through free updates after the launch so they can either meet a quota or just make a game they're proud of. I'm not sure how independent Next Level is from Nintendo, so it's hard to tell what's going on or why they're putting out updates. With all that said, Switch Sports is a weird one for me because as a party game, it's hard to gauge how much content it should have. 100 sports would be nice, but at least 25% of them would be bad, and it would be overwhelming to try and decide. The 6 sports we got is too little and not worth the $40. The only sport we have confirmed as an update is golf in the fall. And even for the free updates, this is too little. At least in Mario Strikers, we got 2 characters and 1 stadium. Granted, golf is probably the most replayable sport of them all, and the sports in Switch Sports are pretty fun, but 7 sports? Really? It just feels like too little too late. I'll go back to Switch Sports to play again when golf gets added, and then put it back down after a couple days until something new is added, if something new is added. This drip feed system doesn't work very well for these type of games. Look, I'm all for post-launch updates, but the games need to have substance to work, and it just ends up killing the game. Here's a system I've seen games that do this fall into. Launch game, online dies a month or 2 after, release new content, online comes alive again, dies quickly after. This system of updates only really seems to affect Nintendo's multiplayer-focused games, as the games with no online they have released have been really good. Fire Emblem 3 Hopes, Pokemon Legends, Kirby and the Forgotten Land, and Xenoblade 3 have all reviewed pretty well, and all have a good amount of content. But in this attempt to keep the online alive through the drip feed and promise of new content, it just ends up killing the game in the long run because people get bored of it so quickly. If you want a game to have a large online player base, it needs to be engaging. These make for good party games, but it's evident the main focus is online, which I find kind of funny given the state of Nintendo Online. Ranting about the state of NSO aside, it's a very self-destructive cycle because as the player base drops over the few months after release, Nintendo would look at it and be like, well, no one plays it anymore, might as well cut support for it, marking the death of a game that would otherwise have been really fun if only it had that extra content. I was originally going to add this next segment in a different video, but I figured I might as well add it in. So, the Splatoon 3 Direct aired a few days ago. I'm really hyped. I was actually going to post my reaction, but OBS didn't record my desktop audio and I didn't want to have to resync everything. That aside, midway through the Direct, they announced Splatoon 3 would have free post-launch updates. And you know what? I think the system works really good for this game. First off, it's launching with a bunch of content, though admittedly I do wish there were a few more stages. Second, the updates look to be consistent. Unlike Mario Strikers and Switch Sports, Splatoon 3 will have at least one update every few months to add to catalog, which is a nice thing to entice players to come back and work towards. It's also really nice to have a time frame for these updates, as Switch Sports and Mario Strikers updates are about as consistent as my upload schedule. It's also confirmed new modes will come through updates, though the only one confirmed is X Battle, and I'm a bit torn on that actually. On one hand, if it's released at the game's launch, there wouldn't be anyone using it since no one would be X rank, but on the other hand, how hard is it to implement? It's just ranked battle, but for X rank. It's weird, but it doesn't affect me much since I'll never be able to get to X rank anyway, but back to my original point. The style of game that Splatoon is fundamentally engaging, as every match is going to be very different and it has a very stable online community. In Splatoon 2, 5 years later, it's still really easy to hop into a turf war with barely any wait times to find people. We also know there will be large-scale paid DLC, which could allow the devs to create an entirely new thing without the time constraints of getting it out by Splatoon 3's release. I think the reason it works so well is just the fact that Splatoon has so much variety, and instead of free updates to finish the game, these are free updates to keep the players engaged. This could be my bias showing since Splatoon is my favorite franchise put out by Nintendo, but I definitely think there's a huge difference in how these games do this update system, and I think Splatoon is doing it great. Alright, now that we've talked about some games, why is Nintendo doing this? It's a fairly recent system, so it's a bit easier to guess why. I've seen a lot of people talk about how it's most likely related to the rise of live service games in the past years, think Fortnite, Apex, etc., so I'll give my own theory to why this is happening. My theory is that Nintendo actually listened to the community. You might be doubting this since the update method seems to be pretty hated throughout the Nintendo community, but let's go back to the release of Kirby and the Forgotten Land to see what I'm talking about. Forgotten Land released, and it was great. I had a great time with it, and many people called it their game of the year. But then, after about a month, the questions started. When DLC? Where DLC? Can we get DLC? And yeah, I wanted some Forgotten Land DLC as much as the next person, but not every game needs DLC. Even back when Mario Odyssey released, the DLC questions were constant. It feels like no new game can release without people asking for DLC. Even with the latest game Nintendo has put out, Kirby's Dream Buffet, people are asking for DLC, and it didn't even come out 2 weeks ago. Heck, I even saw people wanting it to go free to play and then get free content updates. Like, do we want free content updates or not? Rant aside, I feel like Nintendo sees this influx of where DLC comments and cut content off the base game that may not have been fully finished in time so it can be fully finished and fans can get their DLC wishes. This is also why I think Splatoon 3 announced paid DLC at launch, so then people won't keep asking, where's Splat Game 3 DLC? I want Splat Game DLC. And then they get a game not finished with quote unquote DLC and we all get angry about it. If I had to guess, I'd say it's a combination of live service games and the reason I gave, but it just irritates me seeing so many people want DLC and then getting mad when this happens. So with that being said, are Nintendo games still quality? This is a heavy question, and in short, I'd say yes. The games after all the updates are still quality titles. They're not broken, they're not buggy, they're just lacking in content. And the games without these updates, like Kirby and the Forgotten Land, are some of the most polished experiences I've played. It'll take some time to see any effective community outcry against the system, as development takes time, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. Hey all, thanks for watching, and I know I said this in my last video, but thank you so much for the support. If you didn't notice, my previous video did a little better than usual, and it blows my mind that 1.8k people sat down and listened to a kid talk about Minecraft. If you did like what you heard, it would mean a lot if you would drop a like and subscription. I'm gonna get to 100 subs somewhat soon, so if you have any ideas for a 100 sub special, that'd be nice too. But until then, I will see you all in the next one.